So today I want to do an update to my fire focused minion build on the Necromancer, and this build has had some pretty big changes that I think is going to make the final version of this build. And if you haven't seen the previous versions of this build, it's pretty simple. You're just taking all the minions you can, turning them all to fire, and then scaling their damage and scaling your survivability to basically just run around while all of your minions kill everything. And the build is pretty strong. It should allow you to do basically any endgame content you want to do, start stacking up the corruption and monoliths, do any of the different dungeons, and it's also a pretty easy build to use. Now that starts us off in our skills. The first one you're going to be taking is Summon Skeleton, the first ability you're going to be getting. While you're leveling up, the first thing you're going to be doing is getting Fire Arrow and then Multi-Shot. This is going to change your Skeletal Archers into Fire Archers. So now they're going to be spamming out Fire Arrows, and those Fire Arrows are going to have a big AoE now with Multi-Shot. So they're just going to spam out sprays of Fire Arrows, doing pretty big amounts of damage. And currently in this build, we can have 10 of these skeletons. So they're going to be doing a lot of damage because there's so many of them. And then as you continue leveling up, you're going to go get Mightier Than the Sword that removes all warriors from this ability. So originally this ability can summon warriors or archers. We get all fire archers, we remove all warriors. So now we're only going to be summoning fire archers. Then past that, you're just going to get all of the other nodes that allow you to summon more skeletons. So Marrow Walkers gives you one, Hollow Walkers gives you another, and then Grave Walkers gives you more. And then past that, you're just going to be getting damage scaling primarily from Necrotic Conviction for a bunch of additional damage, and then from Sweeping Strikes that also gives some pretty big multiplicative damage increases. And then we're going to be having Bone Golem. The first thing you're going to be getting while leveling up is you're going to go over and get Pyre Golem, which changes your golem into a big fire golem, and it casts a big fire AoE, which also helps to AoE quite a bit. Your golem is going to be doing a lot of damage, and it's also going to be taking a lot of the aggro. You're going to be putting points in a World Pyre, so his big AoE radius is much bigger, allows it to do a lot more AoE damage. Then one of the big parts of your golem, you're going to be going down, you're going to be putting 4 points in a Tower of Bones, which makes it bigger, but it also gives it increased threat generation, which the bigger actually helps, so it's a much bigger target, can soak more attacks, and more threat generation, so things are hitting you less. You want things hitting your golem primarily, and then your other minions over you. Then your 5 last points are just going to be going into Bladed Fist, so your golem gets massively increased multiplicative melee damage. And then we're going to be getting Summon Skeletal Mage, and the first thing you're going to be doing while leveling up, going down and get Pyromancers. So now you can summon Pyromancers as a fire version of Skeletal Mages. Then you're going to go down and get Inferno, which removes normal mages from this. So now, just like our summon skeletons, we're only going to be summoning Pyromancers whenever we use Skeletal Mage, and we can currently have 5 mages up at a time. Mages are going to do pretty decent AoE damage from some of our nodes, and they're going to be doing just really good damage overall. Mages actually do quite a lot of damage. And then the second thing you're going to want while leveling up is, if you want more damage, you can go over and get Splintered Dominion, which gives extra projectiles. So instead of just firing one fireball, which is what Pyromancers normally do, now it'll have a big spread, kind of like our Skeletal Archers, so it has some AoE to it, does more damage. Or you can opt to instead go over and get Grave Passage first, which turns your Skeletal Mage ability into a teleport. So now any place on your screen that you would summon a Skeletal Mage, you can teleport to it. This is a very good teleport. You can teleport across massive ledges, up or down any heights. It's very good for traversal, but it's going to add a 4.5 second cooldown to this ability, which isn't really a big deal because your Skeletal Mages are pretty tanky with all of our stats. So you're not going to usually need to be spamming out more Skeletal Mages while in combat. And then past that, you're going to want to go down and get Order of Death, so you have another Skeletal Mage summon, and then you're just going to want all damage increases. And some of my final points I've changed and put into Cellar Mortars, which gives increased crit chance for our mages. I've been going much more into crit chance for all of my summons. And then once we have some better rolls, one of the pieces of gear I'm looking for can give +3 to our Skeletal Mage, so that will let us max out the Cellar Mortars for a bunch more base crit chance. Then we're getting Summon Wraith as a temporary minion, and the first thing you're going to want to do while leveling up is get Flame Wraith, so you now have a chance to summon Flame Wraith, which are fire scaled minions that are ranged, which is going to help quite a bit. This also gives some multiplicative damage increase for your race, but the 2 points of this only gives you a 22% chance to summon Flame Wraiths. But another really big part of this is you're going to want Adorned Idols that give additional chance to summon Flame Wraiths. So this one is 51%, this one is 46%, so I have over 100% chance. So anytime I use Summon Wraith, it's going to be a Flame Wraith now. These are the main things you're going to be looking for while leveling up, and the main things you're going to want for your idols. Right off the bat, if you can get your Wraiths to 100% chance to summon a Flame Wraith, that'll be some pretty big damage increases. Now at a base, you're able to have 6 Wraiths wraiths up at a time. And because this is pretty much the only thing we're going to be using mana on, or the main thing we're going to be using mana on, you can usually have them up very consistently. So another thing you're going to want to get is to go up and get Covenant of Souls, so you can control an additional +2 wraiths. So we can have 8 wraiths out at a time. These wraiths actually do pretty good damage. They're ranged and they're fire, so they get scaled off a lot of the other things our other minions get scaled off of. So they do quite a lot of damage. If you can keep up 8 most of the time, they're going to be a massive damage increase. And then past that, I'm just going into more ways to keep them alive. So some points into slowing their health decay, 1 point into Wraith Feast, so your crits can now restore health to your wraiths, which is actually pretty good. We have so many minions, they're going to all be able to crit, so you can actually heal your wraiths quite a bit. And then we're going to be going down and we're going to get Spirit Link for increased crit chance. We're going to get more crit chance, and then we're going to get crit multiplier. So when our wraiths crit, they're going to be doing crazy damage. And as this build gets more and more geared, as we get some better rolls, we'll actually be able to get more and more crit for our minions in general, which will massively increase our race damage as well. And then our final ability is going to be Dreadshade. Now this is basically just going to be a damage buff to all of our ranged minions, because how we have this set up is we put one up on a minion, it'll have a big AoE radius, but our golem will be in melee and all of our range will be back away from it. So we put it on one of our range. Generally you want to put on one of your archers, and then all of your mages, your archers, and your wraiths are all going to be getting massive damage boosts from Dreadshade. So starting down, you go down and get Spectral Presence, so it has a much bigger radius. You want Lone Watcher, so now Dreadshade doesn't drain health from the target it's on, but it just makes them take increased damage, and you can only have one, but it has a much longer duration. So now you just put on one archer, it'll stay on there for a long time unless that archer dies, but you can pretty easily reapply to another, has a big radius, lasts a long time, pretty easy to use. Then we're going to be going down, we're going to be getting more damage scaling, so increase attack speed here. Then we're going to have Duskheart. Now this gives a 100% chance for all minions affected by Dreadshade to apply Damned to the target. Now Damned just deals necrotic damage over time and reduces the health regen of the target. Primarily it's for the damage over time, and since we have so many minions attacking so quickly in Dreadshade, you could stack this up to 100 or even over 100 on bosses, which is actually going to do a pretty big chunk of damage. And then one of the big parts of this is Grim Fate. It increases the area and it gives a massive multiplicative damage increase to all minions. So just multiplying all your range minions damage by 60%, this is one of the biggest parts of Dreadshade. And that brings us to our passives. Now when leveling up, the things you want to put your points in are Blood Aura for increased minion damage, Bone Aura for increased armor for you and your minions, and Forbidden Knowledge for intelligence and necrotic resistance. Now you want 8 in the first two, 4 in the last, which will give you your 20 points. Then you'll start putting points more into Necromancy, but then once you get say 100 or get a lot more points, you'll go back into Acolyte tree and put 8 into Stolen Vitality for increased vitality for you and increased minion damage, massively increased minion damage. But once you get to the Necromancer tree, this is where most of your points are going to be put. So primarily you're going to be going into Risen Army for increased minion damage, increased attack speed. You're going to put a couple into Grave Thorns, increased minion health, armor, sub damage reflected, so we can get further into the tree. We currently have 4 into Bone Armor, which gives increased health regen. We primarily take this for the minion health regen. Now I've been thinking about taking all the points out of this, put them all into Grave Thorns, and then put the last point into Elixir of Hunger, because the health regen for minions I don't think is that crazy, and because of how I have this build set up, which we'll go over to once we get into gear, health regen is actually bad for us. So that may be a change you may want to do, is take points out of Blood Armor, put them into Grave Thorns so your minions are just tankier, and then you can get some additional health from Elixir of Hunger as well. Then we have 10 points into Mortal Tether, massively increased minion health, 1 into Unbound Necromancy so we can have another skeleton, helps us get up to our 10 skeletal summons. Then we're taking 8 into Tyrant, massively increased health for us, reduce minion health, but we have massive minion health anyway, so it's not a big deal. Then 8 into Cling to Life, more vitality to us, and gives our minions all resistances, which is really good for their survivability. Then 1 into Tyrant's Legion, which is primarily so we can get another skeletal summon. Then we're going up 1 into Fanatic Summons, so we can get 5 into River of Bones, generally just for our minion leech, and so we get more crit scaling for them. 10 into Heresy for plus 10 intelligence and more minion crit chance. Then we're going down 10 into Moonlight Pyre for more minion fire damage, for 10 into Rite of Undeath, which gives us a bunch of resistances and massive increased damage for our minions, and then 1 into Disciples of Necromancy for another summoned skeletal mage. Now a big change from our last version of the build is we're not using effigies. This has a chance to consume minions when you get low. It does give you increased minion fire damage and bow damage, which will help our minions, but the reason I can take these points out is because this is not multiplicative damage increase increases. It's additive, so it's not a massive damage increase. But one of the big things we change in this build is we are now a ward focused build. And what this would do is this would constantly eat minions because we're constantly sitting at low life, which generates us ward. So if we add points into this passive, it would just constantly eat minions, and it could eat any of your minions. I've even seen it eat golems multiple times. So I had to take this out, lose a little bit of damage, but we're a lot more tanky. And I'm currently not level 100. I'm still only 96, but getting up to 100, we're just going to be putting more points into Elixir of Hunger, which is increased health. And when we potion, we give our minions hunger, which gives them some attack speed and some additional health regen on hit. So not a massive deal once you get up to like mid 90s or even low 90s. Getting from that point to 100 isn't a big deal. You have most of the points you want for everything else. And next up, we have our gear. Now, starting off with our idols, we already went over our adorned idols. Everything else, I'm pretty much just getting health, armor. We have a few small wards with just some armor, some health, and some minion fire damage. I went more increase to health for our stout idols. We'll actually go over why getting more health is really good for the survivability in this build. And then we went some grand idols because they give pretty big minion fire damage increase. Also, as a secondary role on an adorned idol you could get, which is pretty good, is a low chance for minions to apply Mark of Death on hit. This just makes that target take basically 25% increased damage, which doesn't help when you're just killing a bunch of random enemies. But on bosses, this is actually really good because we have so many minions hitting that they'll apply it pretty quickly and just give you some additional damage on bosses pretty easily. Now, once we get into our gear, we've changed up quite a bit. We're using 3 new uniques, and the biggest ones are our chest, our boots, and actually our gloves that massively changes the survivability of this build. As you see, we're sitting at 70 health, but 2600 ward. Ward is very strong, and that comes from these new items. We have Shroud of Obscurity, which 20% of your current health is lost per second, but then 13% of my missing health is gained as ward per second. Then we also just gain some ward per second. So basically how these items work, there will be similar stats on our boots and our gloves, is that we just lose a bunch of health per second, but we gain a bunch of ward based on our missing health. And these effects stack. So as you'll see, we'll be gaining ward when we just have our chest piece on, and we'll lose health still pretty quickly, and we'll gain ward pretty quickly. But you'll start to see the ward start to slow down. But if we put on our boots that have the same or very similar effects, our ward starts to go crazy quickly again, even though our health is already super low. Then we put on our gloves that also have similar effects, and our ward even builds up quicker. So this effect to where you lose percentage of your life per second and you gain a percent of that as ward per second is completely stackable. So on the Shroud of Obscurity, we have that effect. On the Last Steps of the Living Boots, we have that effect again, the exact same effects. And then on our gloves, we also have a lesser version of this effect as an experimental roll. You can also get this experimental roll on the other items that can have experimental on them. So we could also get this on our belt, but this does the exact same thing. It's just a lower roll. I don't even have a good roll on this, just tier 2. So you can get much higher roll on that. And as mentioned, you can completely stack these up. I have 1700 total life, but with these items stacked up, I have 2600 ward. The regens absurdly quickly, much faster than your life could regen, even with a really high life regen. So that's one of the main survivability differences we have in this version than what we used to. And we're still using some of the same uniques. Reach of the Grave, so our minions, spells, and bow attacks do more damage, and those minions will leech, and they have increased attack and cast speed, so we're leeching a bunch of life for our minions, doing more damage. We have Death Rattle. This gives some pretty good crit strike multiplier, a bunch of intelligence, but our minions take increased damage. This is a decent roll except for the increased damage our minions take. It can go down to only 10%, which would be a good roll. This is primarily used for the really good intelligence roll and the minion crit multiplier, so really good for that. And then we've also added a Hollow Finger. Now, Hollow Finger gives more minion damage, more minion health, more minion crit strike multiplier, very good, and it gives +1 to maximum skeleton. So this is really good. Now, if you could get these with legendary potential, it would massively increase the power of a Hollow Finger. 1 Hollow Finger, and I think potentially 2, because I think that max skeleton does stack on these, could actually be very good. Now, past all those uniques we went over, we are primarily going for defensives after this. So on our helm, we have a lot of defensives. On our belt, we have a bunch of defensives. I changed one of my rings to a lot of defensives. Our gloves have a bunch of defensives on them. But then when you get to the offensive rolls on our defensive pieces, you're still just wanting minion damage, basically. So minion damage, you can also get a lot of minion health, which is good. And then we're going to just have all of our defensives. Now, I still have 2 really bad rolls. My offhand and my relic are both still terrible rolls. I have pretty good implicits, which will give just massively increased minion health and damage, some intelligence. So the implicits are really good, but the actual affix rolls on these items are really bad. These items are actually not very well rolled, so I could get massively increased damage and survivability getting good rolls of these. Now, when talking about your general stats, especially your survivability, which is the most important part of the build, you're generally going to be wanting health as your primary stat. I've been going a lot more into health. That also scales our ward even more. So more health, more ward scaling, very good. Then you're going to want your resistances. Now, my resistances are good except for physical, poison, and void that are really low. Now, these are really low because I don't have those two pieces well rolled. Once I get those two pieces well rolled and maybe an upgrade on one other piece, we should be able to even out our resistances a lot better, but I'm still much more tanky with these lower resistances. My last version of the build, I had really good resistances, but I was less tanky. Then you're going to also want armor. I have a little bit more armor at 25% damage reduction, still pretty low, but on an Acolyte Necromancer, it's not super easy to get a ton of armor, but you still want armor, very good stat. And then you're going to want your endurance threshold, and your crit strike avoidance. This is some pretty big increases from my last build video going over this build. I now have capped crit strike avoidance, which is massive, so you basically don't take additional damage from being crit ever, which is really good. I have endurance at 57%, so just 3% off being capped, which is really good. And my endurance threshold is 400, which is pretty good. So most of my defensives are pretty good. I need to up physical, poison, and void resistances. That'll be a pretty big defensive increase. And then past that, it'll pretty much just be getting as much more health and armor as possible. And I'm probably leaning on getting more health than armor at this point. Because as we've gone over, I have 1700 health, 2600 ward that regenerates very quickly. Just getting more health to scale that even more is probably going to be better than getting more armor. But probably a mix of the two would actually be best. And that's pretty much the entirety of this build. And you should be able to do pretty much all endgame content. You should be able to still rise the corruption on this build pretty effectively. The build's damage overall is still really good, even though I lost a ridiculous amount of damage compared to the last version of this build. We still have more than enough damage to keep doing pretty much all the content in the game. Because last Epoch is so much more focused on defensives, we needed to go a lot more into that. That's why so much of my gear has changed to go much more into ward stacking and more to defensives. But you still have enough damage, you're still killing things quickly. So at this point, scaling more and more into the end game is primarily going to be focused on how good of upgrades I can get on my piece of gear to increase our defensives, to get our health up, to get our armor up, and to get our resistances up. But that's the entirety of the build, so thanks for watching.